For 15 years, Kang Joon-Seok, the Raven, ruled Seoul's underworld with a single, absolute law: thou shalt not touch the boss. He was not just untouchable by rivals, he was untouchable by humanity. Grief had turned him into an ice sculpture of authority, a man whose wife was murdered after an assassin brushed past her in a crowd. Since that day, any physical contact was viewed as an act of war, instantly punishable by death. His fortress, Seongjin, operated on a field of lethal repulsion. Doctors, servants, partners, everyone kept a terrified 20-foot distance. They knew the history: a grazed sleeve, a misplaced hand, and you disappeared forever. His power wasn't just wealth, it was the absolute, terrifying control over his own isolation. He was the monster who had everything, yet had given up the one thing that defined life: touch. Then came Amara Okoye, a quiet, resourceful black maid driven by the desperate need to save her dying mother. She knew the rule. She knew the consequences. But when she saw the man beneath the monster, the hollow wreckage of grief, a suicidal compassion ignited in her. She didn't just break the rule. When the guns were raised and her death was imminent, she shattered his code entirely. She reached through the fear, grabbed the Raven's jacket, and delivered the single, most shocking, most lethal act of defiance the Mafia boss had ever experienced. She kissed him. What happened next didn't just shock the mansion, it fractured the foundations of the entire Korean underworld. Because when the untouchable boss was finally touched, the explosion was not violence, but volatile, terrifying obsession. Welcome to Afro-Korean with Hanmoro. Do sit back and enjoy. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories. The Granite Mansion, Seongjin, did not feel like a home. It felt like a sarcophagus. High above Seoul, it stood as the silent, brutal monument to the man who controlled its every shadow, Kang Joon-Seok, the Raven. His power flowed not from visible muscle, but from an absolute, chilling isolation enforced by a single, terrifying law: thou shalt not touch the boss. This rule was sacred, and it was lethal, born 15 years ago on the day his wife was murdered. The assassin had brushed past her in a crowded market, delivering the fatal dose of poison in that fleeting contact. Since that day, King had retreated behind an invisible wall of air, terrified that any connection meant death. To breach his space was to violate his grief, and the consequence was instantaneous, irreversible erasure. The rule manifested as the 20-foot rule. Every servant, every guard, every high-ranking advisor maintained a terrifying 20-foot radius around him. In the cavernous halls of Seongjin, this distance was always visible, always policed. The staff understood the reality. 2 weeks ago, a veteran maid, cleaning a bronze railing, had misjudged her angle. Her polishing cloth had trailed over the edge of a mahogany table just as Kang Joon-Seok passed by. She hadn't even touched him, but her cloth had violated the sacred space. Captain Seo Jinwoo and his men appeared silently. They did not shout. They simply took her arm, leading her away, her terrified silence broken only by the cold clink of the keys being removed from her uniform. She was gone by nightfall. The mansion was a mausoleum of grief, where the fear of contact was the only thing keeping the servants alive. Kang Joon-Seok himself was the physical manifestation of this cold power. His tailored suits were impeccable, his face a chiseled mask of authority and profound, desolate sadness. He sat in his study, a vortex of lethal solitude, reviewing dossiers that detailed the movements of his rivals. He was untouchable, not by choice, but by the relentless, crushing weight of his own history. He was the most powerful man in the city, yet he was utterly alone. The position of laundress had been vacant since the last unfortunate incident. The need for absolute sterility meant a new hire was inevitable, but the fear of being the one to finally break the code was palpable among the remaining staff. The replacement was due to arrive at dawn, a woman with nothing left to lose. Then the Black Maid arrived. The Black Maid was named Amara Okoye. Her quiet arrival was noted by the security cameras and immediately distrusted by the house staff. She moved through the initial orientation with a respectful, almost eerie composure, a stark contrast to the jittery terror of the previous employees. Amara possessed the quiet resilience of someone whose survival instincts had been honed by true desperation. She took the job because the salary, lethal as the risk was, could buy the one thing Kang Joon-Seok's billions couldn't touch: her mother's life. Her mother, Grace Okoye, was declining steadily, and the bills from the private clinic had just reached a tipping point. Just 2 days after Amara started, a low, desperate call came through on the servant's private line. It wasn't the usual update, it was a final, cold ultimatum. The last payment was overdue, and Grace would be moved by the end of the week. Amara's heart seized. She was now truly racing against time, forced to stay in the fortress of fear to prevent her mother from going to a place where people went to die forgotten. In the cavernous laundry room, Zuri, a fellow black maid, eyed Amara with a mix of suspicion and empathy. "You're too calm," Zuri whispered, the sound muted by the heavy industrial dryers. "You look at him when he passes. Everyone else looks at the floor." Amara paused, folding a crisp white sheet with meticulous precision. "I look at him because I need to understand the danger," she replied, her voice low. "He doesn't have danger, he is danger," Zuri countered, looking over her shoulder. "They say he has no soul left. He only sees bodies, enemies, tools, or staff. You are a tool. You must be silent." But Amara couldn't obey that final command. She observed the boss, the untouchable Raven, not with fear, but with a deep analytical focus. She noticed the profound weariness in his shoulders, the way his gaze always avoided the mirror, the slight tremor in his hand when he paused near the West Wing, the wing where his murdered wife had lived. Amara saw past the tailored suit and the lethal reputation. She didn't see a monster, she saw a man who had built his immense power as a prison to contain his grief. He was not a boss, he was a project of broken humanity, and the price of his silence was the constant isolation that tormented him. Amara knew that this man, consumed by his own history, had inadvertently become her last hope for survival. She needed his money, but the longer she watched him, the more she realized that the 20-foot rule was not just protecting him from harm, but from any chance of healing. The only way to save her mother was to stay silent and invisible. But the observation was quickly becoming unbearable. She would soon break the only rule that mattered. The weight of the house pressed on Amara every day, a silent, psychological torment. But the tension only amplified her silent observation of Kang Joon-Seok's cold routines. She had managed to maintain the strict distance, her movements precise and ritualistic, yet her mind was restless. Her curiosity about the man who lived in the core of the danger began to outweigh her fear of the consequences. Kang's private study, located in the silent heart of the West Wing, was the mansion's deepest sanctum. It was forbidden territory for the general staff. Amara was only permitted to clean the hallway outside, a space that smelled perpetually of leather, rare whiskey, and the phantom metallic scent of the boss's authority. She often lingered, knowing that every moment spent near the nucleus of his power was simultaneously the most dangerous and the most informative. One afternoon, Kang was called away suddenly, a high-stakes emergency that demanded his immediate presence. He left the study with a typical, lethal haste, but his concentration was clearly fractured. He forgot to fully engage the magnetic lock on the heavy, darkwood door. It clicked shut, but remained slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning Amara forward. Ignoring the frantic voice of survival screaming in her mind, Amara moved. She entered the study, driven by the impulse to understand the man who held her mother's fate in his hands. The room was grand, dominated by an obsidian desk and an imposing wall of dark, sealed shelves. It was there, behind a hinged panel disguised as a book spine, that she found the breach in the Raven's armor. It was a hidden archive. Not files of money or power, but old photographs. There were many of his late wife, frozen in smiles he never wore. But deeper inside, there were images of Kang himself, from years ago, showing moments of profound weakness, laughing, looking vulnerable, sometimes even crying. Photos taken before the murder had hardened him into the Raven. Amara realized her hypothesis was right. He was not born a monster, he was forged by grief, and these images were the only proof he kept of his lost humanity. As she carefully slid the hinged panel back into place, her fingers brushed against something cold and thin taped to the back of the hidden compartment. She peeled it off, a slim, leather-bound document labeled Emergency System Protocol, SEONGJON. It detailed the weaknesses and manual overrides for the house's complex magnetic and surveillance systems. The document was a tool of unimaginable power, granting her insight into the fortress's nervous system. She carefully tucked the manual into the hidden pocket of her apron. She had broken the rule of sight and now held the blueprint to his physical domain. The mistake was not entering the room, but what she was about to do with the weapon she found. The pressure of the secret manual in Amara's apron pocket was a constant, dangerous reminder of her transgression. She spent the next week balancing the terror of discovery with the vital importance of the information she had gained about Kang's emotional state. Her movements were flawless, her invisibility perfect, but her focus was strained. It happened in an instant of fatal clumsiness. Amara was dusting the elaborate shelving in the library, a space adjacent to the study. Kang Joon-Seok was seated at his desk, his concentration deep, his customary 20-foot radius of silence absolute. She reached for a specific, heavy antique glass tumbler, a priceless piece, and her fingers, slick with nervous sweat, failed. The tumbler slipped. It struck the edge of the mahogany desk and exploded into 1,000 glittering shards on the pristine marble floor near the study's entrance. Crack. The sound was not just loud, it was the sound of a law breaking. Immediately, the house is silent. Red emergency lights flashed dimly. The sound was interpreted as a hostile action. In less than 3 seconds, the room was flooded with armed men. Captain Seo Jinwoo and 2 security personnel burst through the door, weapons leveled directly at Amara. Park Min-jae, his face a mask of cold fury, appeared alongside Choi Dae-hyun, the strategist, who looked sickened by the breach. Every senior operative was there for the kill order. Amara froze, her hands raised, surrounded by laser pointers aimed at her chest. She saw Park Min-jae's contempt and Captain Seo's detached professionalism, both expecting her final moment. She knew the protocol: disturbance, proximity, death. Her gamble had failed. She closed her eyes, accepting the consequence. But the order never came. Kang Joon-Seok rose slowly from his desk. He walked with measured, terrifying control across the room, ignoring the drawn guns and the frantic shouts of his men demanding the Maid be secured. His eyes were not on the shattered glass or the weapons. They were locked solely on Amara's face, searching deep into her gaze for deception, for malice, for the killer he expected to find. He stopped inches from her, violating the 20-foot rule with cold disregard. Amara could feel his breath, the heat of his anger, the sheer, paralyzing force of the man no one dared touch. He was so close that she could see the tiny, faint scar above his eyebrow, the one detail she had noticed in her weeks of observation. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the boss to pass the fatal sentence. The silence stretched, thick with lethal possibility. Amara stared back, not with fear, but with a desperate, sudden recognition of the man's profound loneliness. Her fate was sealed. She was going to die. But if she was going to die, she would do it with one final, impossible act of defiance against the fear that consumed him. She did the unthinkable. The air between Amara and Kang Joon-Seok was thick with lethal intent, yet Amara saw past the gun barrels and the boss's cold glare. She saw the wound that had turned him into the Raven, the fear of contamination that had shaped his entire life. The choice was clear: die a victim of his code, or challenge the code itself. With a final, desperate surge of courage, Amara reached out, her hands flying past the raised weapons and the shocked faces of the guards. She grasped the lapels of his immaculate suit, hauled the 6-foot-tall mafia boss down to her level, and pressed her lips firmly against his. The impact was not physical, it was temporal. The room froze. The guards, Park Min-jae, Captain Seo, the armed men, stood petrified, their weapons lowered slightly in absolute, stunned disbelief. An act of suicidal intimacy was the one scenario their training had never covered. Amara held the kiss for a long, aching moment, a silent declaration against the 20-foot rule and the fear it represented. When she finally pulled back, her chest heaving, she braced herself for the explosion, the punch, the shot, the ultimate violence. Kang Joon-Seok didn't move. He stood utterly motionless, his entire body rigid with shock. His sharp eyes were wide, and the iron mask of control he always wore had shattered, revealing a deep, terrifying confusion. He was not immediately enraged. He was paralyzed by the violation of his sacred code. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he slowly raised a hand, his gaze never leaving Amara's face, and lightly touched the spot where her lips had been. His expression transitioned from shock to a volatile, profound realization. The contact hadn't killed him. It had broken the spell of his grief. "Boss, the girl must be secured," Park Min-jae hissed, recovering his voice. Kang's eyes snapped to his right-hand man. His voice was low, strained, and laced with an unsettling tremor of power that was fundamentally new. It was not the voice of a boss giving an order for execution, but a man demanding isolation. "Everyone," Kang commanded, the words slicing through the tension. "Out. Now." He ignored Park's sputtering protest. "Captain Seo, you will clear the room. You will forget this moment." The senior operatives retreated, their confusion and fear now mixed with a potent, dangerous curiosity. Amara stood alone with the Raven, the shattered glass glistening around them like evidence of a crime. He slowly walked toward his desk, his eyes never leaving her, the fear of death finally replaced by a chilling, predatory obsession. He didn't issue a threat, he simply circled her, his gaze lingering on her mouth, realizing the maid had just exposed him to the greatest danger and the greatest possibility of his life. And that was only the beginning. The days following the kiss were a slow, terrifying disorientation for everyone in Seongjin. The rules of the house were flipped, and Kang Joon-seok's volatile reaction was not punishment, but a terrifying form of possession. Amara was no longer a maid. She was an essential, dangerous component of his existence, a constant presence that violated every law he had lived by. He integrated her into his life with immediate, clinical obsession. He summoned her to his study and forced her to sit in a chair placed precisely where the 20-foot boundary used to be. He didn't demand conversation. He demanded proximity. While he reviewed dossiers and issued commands that controlled the city, Amara was simply there, a silent, living counterbalance to his isolation. The sight of the boss working with the black maid just feet away sent shockwaves of confusion and fear through the staff. Kang's protection of Amara was absolute and lethally public. The opportunity arose during a routine meeting with a minor rival who made a casual, derogatory comment about the new distraction in Kang's mansion. Kang rose from his chair, his eyes colder than ever, and dragged the rival into the hallway. The subsequent violence was swift, brutal, and horrifyingly witnessed by the entire security detail. Kang returned, wiping the blood from his hands, and fixed the remaining men with a lethal glare. "He insulted my property," he stated, the words chilling in their implication. He had killed, using Amara's mere presence as his justification. Later that evening, in his study, Kang approached Amara. He didn't offer an apology or an explanation. He simply produced a small, velvet box containing a diamond pendant, ancient, magnificent, and clearly priceless. He did not hand it to her as a gift. Instead, he forced her to stay still while he fastened the heavy chain around her neck. "This is not a reward," he murmured, his voice low, his fingers brushing the skin beneath her ear, the first safe touch. "It is a marker. They will know what you are to me now." Amara felt the weight of the diamond, a beautiful, cold symbol of ownership. She had broken his code of fear only to become his most valuable, most volatile possession. The underworld, reading the signs of the public killing and the marker of ownership, recognized the sudden, dangerous shift. The Raven now had a fatal weakness. The whispers spread through the city, no longer mocking, but wary. The untouchable boss was addicted to the touch of the Maid. His rivals, however, saw the pendant not as a treasure, but as the perfect target. His enemies noticed the weakness. The Mafia boss's sudden, public obsession with Amara was a tectonic shift in the city's power structure. Lee Sang-won, the calculating rival who had long sought to dismantle Kang Joon-Seok's empire, saw the diamond pendant around Amara's neck not as a symbol of love, but as the clearest tactical flaw in the Raven's armor. Kang had finally made himself vulnerable, and Lee intended to exploit that fatal softness. The initial attempts to hurt Amara were predictable, small, failed assassinations and attempts to poison her food. Kang's security team, led by a newly obsessive Captain Seo Jinwoo, neutralized these easily. But Lee Sang-won was smarter. He knew that physical harm would only incite Kang's unstoppable, violent rage. He needed to strike at something Kang could not kill or control. Lee found the true weakness, Amara's desperate motivation. He located Grace Okoye, Amara's sick mother, in the private clinic. The threat arrived not as a bullet, but as a chilling, anonymous medical report slipped onto Kang's desk. The report detailed an urgent, life-threatening procedure Grace Okoye required, a procedure that had been mysteriously scheduled for the next day with an inexperienced surgeon, clearly designed to fail. The message was subtle but terrifyingly clear. The real asset is not the maid, but the person she cares about most. Kang Joon-seok's icy control finally fractured under a legitimate, unkillable threat. He realized that every act of possessiveness had only amplified the danger to Amara and her mother. He was forced to make a choice that would collapse his entire empire, secure the assets needed for an immediate, protective takeover of the clinic, or remain focused on the rival meeting that would cement his control over Seoul's international ports. The empire versus Amara's life. Amara, witnessing the depth of his panicked distress and the terrifying reality of the threat to her mother, finally understood her role. Her presence wasn't a comfort. It was a lethal weapon pointed at his head. Kang was willing to sacrifice everything, his power, his reputation, his life's work, to protect her. She saw his overwhelming vulnerability not as love, but as a threat to his very survival. While Kang frantically mobilized his forces, preparing to launch a full-scale, bloody war against the clinic and Lee Sang-won's holdings, Amara made a quiet, definitive decision. She could not allow him to destroy himself or his empire for her. The solution was not to stay and be protected, but to remove the target entirely. She decides to leave. Amara couldn't stay. To remain by Kang's side meant that every move Lee Sang-won made would be calculated to exploit the woman he possessed. She was not a shield. She was an anchor dragging him toward ruin. She waited until Kang finally succumbed to his exhaustion, falling into a deep, drug-induced sleep administered by his private doctor. At 4 a.m., using the detailed knowledge from the emergency system protocol manual she had hidden, she moved silently through the fortress. The manual was her key. She manually overrode the magnetic locks and bypassed the pressure sensors that guarded the perimeter. She moved not as a fleeing servant, but as a spy dismantling the security of her own stronghold. She took only her necessary funds and, critically, the diamond pendant. She placed the pendant, a heavy marker of ownership, on his pillow, beside a single, stark note. It contained only 5 words: "I am not your weakness." When Kang Joon-seok woke and found the evidence of his profound failure, the note, the pendant, and the silence, his control vanished utterly. He erupted in a terrifying, devastating emotional collapse. He did not issue calculated orders. He unleashed raw, uncontrolled fury. The cold, impenetrable shell of the Raven cracked, and the entire city felt the tremor. Park Min-jae described the event as an unprecedented manhunt. Kang stopped all business, refusing to eat or sleep, dedicating every resource to finding the maid who had exposed his human heart. The city's underworld operations ground to a violent halt. Rivals were executed for simple association with anyone in Amara's past. Kang's grief and desperation were so consuming that he neglected the core structure of his empire, leaving a dangerous void. Amara, however, was not hiding. She immediately secured her mother in a non-traceable, high-level medical facility. Then, she dedicated herself to her transformation. She enrolled in intense, private courses, leveraging her natural intelligence and observational skills. She didn't study self-defense, she studied power. She learned high-stakes corporate law, international finance, and the cold, precise language of asset management. She turned her fierce survival instincts into professional prowess, preparing to re-enter the fortress not as a maid seeking protection, but as a strategic force capable of defending both herself and the man she loved. While Kang was blinded by his emotional wreckage, Lee Sang-won saw his chance. He began moving against Kang's key financial partners, preparing for the final, hostile takeover. Amara received the news of the impending attack. She was ready. 3 months after walking out a Maid, she purchased a ticket back to Seoul, but she was unrecognizable. She returns, but not as a maid. Amara's return was a calculated masterpiece of timing. She did not drive to Seongjin. She drove to the sleek, mirrored skyscraper where Lee Sang-won was executing the final stage of his hostile takeover, meeting with the key shareholders and advisors of the Kang Syndicate. Lee expected a triumph. He was about to receive a shock. Amara walked into the penthouse boardroom, no longer dressed in a maid's uniform, but in a severe, exquisitely tailored business suit that commanded silence. Her hair was styled with professional precision, and her entire posture radiated an unnerving, self-possessed power. She was accompanied by a team of high-priced corporate lawyers. Kang Joon-Seok, gaunt and weary from his desperate, fruitless search, was already seated at the table, his typical ruthless edge dulled by grief. When he saw Amara, the change in his expression was devastating. Confusion, raw disbelief, and an immediate, intense surge of emotion that made his hands tremble. Lee Sang-won, dismissive and arrogant, snorted. "The laundress has returned? Excellent timing." She can serve the coffee on her way out. Amara smiled, a glacial expression that cut across the boardroom's tension. "Mr. Lee," she stated, her voice clear, articulate, and completely devoid of fear. "I am here to inform you that your financial assumptions are catastrophically flawed." She then laid out a concise, irrefutable argument, using terminology that silenced the shareholders. She revealed a complex, hidden structure of international debt Lee had leveraged, demonstrating that his proposed takeover would trigger a clause that would wipe out the majority of his own assets. She had used her 3 months of intense study to expose the flaws in his endgame. The takeover collapsed instantly. Amara had neutralized Lee not with a gun, but with a balance sheet. Later, back at Seongjin, the atmosphere was thick with residual tension. Kang cornered her in his study, his eyes pleading. "You left me to save me. Now you return a warrior. What are your terms?" Amara met his gaze, unflinching. "My terms are simple. I am not your maid. I am not your property. I am your partner. You will not touch me unless I invite it. Our power must be mutual." In an unprecedented display of emotional surrender, Kang Joon-seok walked back toward the table where the shareholders had met. He looked at Park Min-jae and Choi Dae-hyun, the men who had always defined his authority. He then slowly, deliberately knelt on one knee before Amara. "I accept your terms," he said, his voice husky with earned respect. "You saved my life, my honor, and my empire." She owns the name now. The mafia boss had surrendered his power, not to an enemy, but to the woman he loved. Their alliance was sealed in mutual respect and terrifying capability. But Lee Sang-won, cornered and humiliated, had one last, desperate card to play, one final act of sabotage. A final betrayal threatens everything. The final betrayal was swift and devastatingly effective. Lee Sang-won, stripped of his assets and humiliated in the boardroom, chose not to run, but to inflict one final, irreparable wound. He launched a suicide attack, targeting the fortress itself. He leveraged a hidden, tactical team to breach the outer defenses during a scheduled system maintenance, aiming to eliminate Kang Joon-Seok and Amara in one bloody stroke. The alarm sirens screamed through Seongjin, the sound shattering the newfound peace. Kang immediately reverted to the Raven, his eyes burning with lethal intent. He grabbed a weapon, ready to defend the house and Amara with the violence the underworld expected. "We moved to the panic room," he roared, pulling Amara toward the emergency escape route. "No," Amara countered, her voice sharp and steady. She used the communication system to access the security grid. Lee didn't come to win the Empire, he came to kill the partners. His men are targeting the archives and the command center, not the private wings. If we run, we lose control. Using the knowledge from the emergency system protocol she had studied, Amara took charge. She didn't fight with a gun, she fought with strategy. She directed Captain Seo Jinwoo's forces to specific ventilation shafts and blind spots Lee's team was using for entry. She isolated the power grid to the eastern wing, trapping Lee's main force in the library, and then remotely activated a high-pressure fire suppression system, neutralizing the threat without a single death on their side. Kang watched, stunned, as Amara used the technical skeleton of his own fear-based empire against his most volatile enemy. She had saved him, not through sacrifice, but through superior tactical brilliance. The confrontation ended with Lee Sang-won captured and neutralized, defeated not by brute force, but by the intellectual prowess of the woman who had been his maid. That night, in the quiet aftermath, Kang Joon-seok stood before Amara. He had a choice: reclaim the violence and control the chaos, or step away and accept the profound transformation she represented. He chose her. He chose life, honesty, and partnership over the cold, lethal isolation of his past. He called his most trusted advisor, Choi Dae-hyun, and formally announced his decision. He would step away from the active, violent operations of the syndicate. He used his immense wealth and legitimate assets to build a massive, international protective structure, a shield designed not to kill, but to defend. Amara, now his equal and partner, used her influence to dedicate the foundation to philanthropy and advocacy for the vulnerable, ensuring that her mother's suffering and her own desperate survival were translated into a lasting legacy. Seongjin was remodeled, its cold granite warmed by life and shared power. The mafia boss was finally free from the 20-foot rule and the ghost of his past. He belonged to Amara. The world feared the Raven and the power he commanded, but his life, his legend, and his ability to touch and be touched belonged only to her.